Welcome to In the Space. I'm your host, Martin Sweeney, and I will be talking with friends, artists, activists, neighbors, and leaders about disability and community. In the Space is a virtual conversation acknowledging and celebrating disability culture and identity in all its history, diversity, and creative self-expression. Our thanks to Pasadena Media for making this broadcast possible. Hello, I'm your host, Martin Sweeney, and this is In the Space, a show highlighting disability, identity, and culture. But first, a little background. Last year, weeks before we were all thrown into a global pandemic, Pasadena lost one of its own. Many of you knew Robert Gorski, Pasadena's first accessibility issues coordinator, a position Robert held proudly for more than 30 years. Next time you stroll down a curb ramp, park in an accessible parking space, wait at an accessible pedestrian signal, use an assisted living device, or benefit from public policies supporting equal opportunity for employment, chances are Robert was all over it, including accessible viewing sections every New Year's for Pasadena's Tournament of Roses parade. That was Robert. At the time of his death, Robert was host for the Pasadena media show, Access for All, a show highlighting the Americans with Disabilities Act. Robert shared his deep knowledge of the ADA with his characteristic insight and humor. Robert's death was a blow to us all, and Pasadena Media wanted to ensure that its diverse programming continued to include our local disability community. And so here we are today. In the Space is all about building community, about connections, about your neighbors, about people down the street, around the corner, our friends, our families, people you may know and people you may never have heard of before. Together, we will explore the disability space and how it shapes identity and culture. Our guest today, Josh Halstead, is an assistant professor of disability and design at Art Center College of Design, where he is also an alum. Halstead has lectured in academic and industry settings from Stanford to Google and is co-author of the forthcoming book, Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field guide for graphic designers to be published in the spring of 2021 by Princeton Architectural Press. Here's a short video that will help introduce Josh.
My name is Josh Halstead. I'm an instructor here at UC Berkeley Extension. I come from a background in branding. I worked at Landor for about 4 years on the creative side. I chose to teach. It was a decision about, well, I'm going to start transitioning from paper to people. So that's my tagline. But I really, truly think that the magic happens within people and relationships, and that's what I care most about. So teaching is just a way for me to extend that. Class is visual design principles, so the 101 of art and design. So we look at typography, we look at imagery, we look at how do you create these things called, brand identity systems. Not just how it fits together, but what it actually means and what the communication value is of each bit. So it's incredibly important for a student to come out of school with a portfolio. Because that's the first thing that an employer is going to be looking at, especially for a career as a UX or a traditional graphic designer. And that portfolio should be very ironed out to express the range of your skills, but very concisely wrap in your personal narrative, right? So how do all the skills that you've acquired so far fit into a holistic resume, not just your resume that starts from, UC Berkeley Extension on. So I hope that every student gains creative confidence, right? That's something that David Kelly has said, but I really mean it, above and beyond anything else, because we go over the fine points and make sure that everything's buttoned up. The biggest thing that I want anyone to walk away with is the confidence to be creative, right? Whatever that next step is.
Well, welcome, Josh. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Well, as I had mentioned in my introduction, this program, this show, is an effort to build community here in Pasadena and Southern California. So the connections that people have with Pasadena are important. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your connection with Pasadena?
Well, I grew up in Southern California, so I was there for most of my life before moving to San Francisco, where I live now. And I went to Art Center, as you called out, for my undergraduate degree in graphic design. So I spent many days and many nights in the heart of Pasadena, in Linda Vista. I think that's the street that goes up, leads all the way up to Art Center. So close place to my heart.
And you're teaching there now too, as well, right?
And I'm teaching there now.
Well, I wanted to have you as our first guest for a lot of different reasons. But one, because of your work as a designer, I know that designers think very long and hard about what influences people, oftentimes without even thinking about what they're looking at or seeing. So what sort of brought you into design, and how has disability informed that experience for you?
Well, I can probably answer the questions together. I often tell people that my mind might be better suited to be a lawyer or an accountant, but it's the fact that I was born with a disability in a world that didn't necessarily plan on my arrival, that I'm a designer. So from basically day one, whether it was physical therapy or designing a way to draw or designing a way to get into like a family car, eating dinner, all of these kind of daily activities that depend on artifacts and objects that aren't, that are made for quote unquote normal bodies. In my case, hands that can grab. We had to, as a family, and me as a very young person, have a hand in design, kind of out of necessity. So, I mean, I was an artist. I loved to draw. I loved to paint. But my kind of foray into design was just this kind of dissatisfaction with the world not designed for me.
Okay. So that brings me then to you had an artistic bent from day one, probably, and then it sort of led you into design and art center. Let's talk a little bit about disability identity and culture. For some people, that's kind of either an unknown sort of area or relatively new. Where do we even start in terms of when we talk about disability identity and culture?
Well, I might toggle back and forth with you because I think you also have a good perspective on it. For me, I kind of think back to the beginning of I'd say disability rights movements and political action here in the United States and the United Kingdom around late 1960s, early 1970s, where folks are getting together to basically protest for their civil right to accessible services, buildings, access to the university, where we were living in a world where it was legal to discriminate against disabled people. And so for the first time, to fight for something called the Rehabilitation Act here in the States, disabled people kind of came from the four corners and started to realize that they had a political identity as well. So where before folks were kind of in smaller communities, if that, lots of disabled people still today are very alienated. But they were more grouped around disability categories like deafness, like blindness, et cetera. But when it became a political issue and the opportunity came to pass to enter into political activism, it became advantageous for disabled people to group up together, and thus it becomes a legal minority category, and then disability identity starts to form because folks get together, right? And what happens when folks get together and automatically have access, or start, not automatically, but begin to have access to the political system, the education system, economic system, is that culture starts to form. So we can have lots of conversations on the kind of the intricacies of identity and culture, and knowing that there's no such thing as one disability identity and one disability culture. But for me, I kind of pin it to that beginning of the political activism and folks coming together in order to fight for their civil right to access.
It's interesting. Now, my introduction to the disability community is as a parent. So my daughter was born in 1983. So what you've just described, that was very much at play. That was prior to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it was also somewhere in the middle of where the disability rights movement probably started in the late 60s and into the 70s. That identity of having a political voice really was monumental in terms of our family and beginning to understand that there was this identity that was political. But that was a long time ago already. And I'm just curious as to what thoughts you might have about this idea of culture and identity.
I'll speak from my perspective just to make sure that it's in that context. So in my experience, disability identity is a way for, it's like other identities, like Latinx identity, like trans identity, like Black identity, where you have access not just to rights, right, but you have access to community. You have, in disability culture and identity, disability identity is a way to flip a lot of these negative narratives upside down. Typically, folks think about disability identity or disability with respect to maybe the medical aspects of what disability might be. And for many people, what it means to be disabled is a tragedy, or it's something that's not advantageous. So disability identity is really giving folks a way to own themselves in a way that's typically kind of pushed to the side by mainstream society. So when I think about disability identity in my world, it's a group of friends who I've met through disability studies, communities, through activism, through all these kind of different pockets of just existing, and we come together because we're disabled, right? And we come together because we have kind of common, very different experiences of the world, but there is that kind of common desire to start flipping the narrative, and also just create refuge, because so often with these kind of negative narratives, it's not the easiest for one's identity to always be kind of either have to occupy a tragic identity or overcome that identity just to be accepted. So,
my experience, Josh, here in Pasadena is that, and Pasadena has a long historic reputation as being very philanthropic and supporting all sorts of entities and nonprofits, et cetera. So to that extent, Pasadena is amazing. But there is, I think, a tripwire in terms of linking disability identity with philanthropy or with charity. It tends to sort of frame disability, first and foremost, as a community of need. And to me, that's narrow, and it gets in the way of actually seeing somebody and understanding their identity and maybe a cultural context. Your thoughts on that?
So it's a common framing that we encounter in disability community, to kind of be identified as a category of people who are always in need. And when I think about this idea of identity, I think back to my friend Neil Marcus, who was very active in Berkeley in this kind of political scene that we're talking about in the 70s and 80s. And when Neil came into his disability identity, he actually learned it from Black and gay liberation movements happening in Berkeley, and specifically the Black is Beautiful movement. And when we think about the Black is Beautiful movement, I mean, it was really a pushback against all kinds of racialized and oppressive narratives and ideologies around what it meant to be Black at that period of time in the United States. So paralleling that to disability identity. I mean, Black is beautiful is basically saying that Black is beautiful. And we're asking the same thing. Well, disability is beautiful. So where can we move from that point? What if it's okay to be disabled, right? And from that point and from that kind of refuge, all kinds of things are possible rather than kind of being labeled and classified always as at a disadvantage, right? Which is complicated.
Well, let's tease that out a little bit more. You're a designer, and I know that you have a lot of experience with branding. So part of this is about communication and about perception. And as a designer, what thoughts do you have about reframing disability in such a way that we get through? You know, I'll give you an example. Yeah. When I watch television and I see, you know, an ad come up for Shriners Hospital, I see these darling, cute kids begging for money, offering a lovely blanket if you give $20 a month. And it's not, it doesn't feel that different to me than the Jerry Lewis telethons back in the day. So obviously, people are still using branding and marketing messages in a way that is not particularly progressive. Thoughts about that?
Yes, well, so it sounds like maybe there's two questions. One, yes, people are continuing to use these disability stereotypes that have been tried and true. Jerry Lewis is a perfect example of that, where disabled people are infantilized and in order to make money, right? So, and that plays on ideas that it's, you know, pitiful to be someone with a disability, it's tragic, etc. Therefore, kind of prompting the knee-jerk reaction to give money because we want to be saviors and help, right? But when it comes to, you know, and that idea, of course, makes its way through culture and becomes really the platform from which disability identity pushes back.
But how is this message break free from that kind of philanthropic, charity-based, pity-based model? And I think we've been struggling with that for a long, long time, and we continue to struggle with that.
Right.
So as a designer, where are you on that?
I mean, I like to position disability as something very complex in the design classroom. To move away from, number one, I like to help people understand their positionality, where they're related to these narratives themselves, like how they've popped up in their lives, how many of these beliefs still maybe exist, and then start challenging them around, really, again, this idea that disability, like any identity category, is a unique lens into the world, right? Into the world of design, into systems, into you name it, right? As a designer, if I'm thinking about color, I'm designing a new color palette because I'm a graphic designer. And I think about that through the lens of low vision or through color blindness, for example. My choices are going to be completely different, and my entire design process typically is going to be shifted. And being able to back up and not use disability, but look kind of work through these design problems, these design challenges, through centering disability experience rather than having it be a tack on. Showing students how this completely changes typically the questions that they're asking and most of the system that they drag through it as well, if that makes sense.
Someone is thinking about disability as a designer.
Yeah.
Does it have to be aesthetically pleasing or not? I mean, I think about people who maybe acquire a disability and are going to now need a ramp into their home. And more often than not, by the time that ramp is done, it looks like part of an orthopedic hospital as opposed to something that has an intrinsically, aesthetically pleasing component to it.
Right.
How do you address those things?
I think so that access as content or access as design or access as item or artifact paradigm is interesting, because there will be certain outcomes when you're thinking about access and centering access, right? Some of it might be untraditionally beautiful in its own way, but there's a lot that can also be absolutely breathtaking, right? So Liz Jackson is someone who I think about on this question, who has this really beautiful cane designed by Ria Norgard of SY Partners, who is really foregrounds this idea of material and assistive technology. But I mean, when we're thinking about the question of does accessible technology and design need to be beautiful, I like to think also about this heuristic used by blind architect Chris Downey, where he likes to kind of move from universal design, quote unquote, to universal delight. So it's another challenge, right, for designers to not just stop at, we've ticked all the boxes, this is ADA compliant, but how can we not just give folks access to the space, but how can we really make them feel welcome and excited, engaged in the space?
Any particular reason why you moved to Northern California versus Southern California with regards to disability identity and culture?
No, I completely just encountered it without any knowledge. So like many of us, or without any kind of forethought, right? I didn't plan. Like many of us, I actually through college did not identify as disabled, just because of being raised, and it's not necessarily to do with parents or community. It's just this is the culture that tells us that being disabled means that you're not a hard worker, or it's something that's not good for your identity, or you should overcome it. So I spent so much time just in the space of not being disabled, quote unquote, and overcoming it. So I, quote unquote, overcoming. So I.
Did you have an epiphany? Did you all of a sudden one day wake up and say, wait a minute, I'm part of this group?
I met people who were okay with being disabled, and they said I should be the same. And I was like, well, you know what? I can't really escape it, and it would make looking in the mirror a lot easier. I'll give it a try. And then all of a sudden my world just broke in half.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. And then I found myself in the Bay Area, which is a hotbed of all of this. So it was a complete,
So, this very show is an effort to try to build community here in Pasadena and in the surrounding areas. Your thoughts on how to take a lot of what we've talked about this afternoon and apply them towards, literally building community, even in a, practical, not overly ambitious necessarily way, but a way in which people can begin to connect with one another, even though their experience might be diverse in terms of what it means to be someone with a disability.
Right. I mean, I think that's the nail on the head. I think it's really important to think about culture and community as plural, always, communities, cultures, because folks are coming from all, many different locations, right? So I would think about step one, if we're looking at, and we're kind of thinking about community building and organizing, including disability in what you're in the agenda, what you're doing, right? So it's been interesting and fun for me as I've entered this world as a disability advocate, and designer and design educator, to start bringing these topics to light in places like design classrooms or conferences, and to see the amount of people that reach out to me afterward. That's a community, right? And just because disability is being discussed in a place that it hadn't traditionally been discussed. So it's important. And I also think about someone like the Ford Foundation, who's integrating disability justice and disability rights into all of their grant making infrastructure. Kind of, it's not separate. There aren't kind of disability and rights and justice grants, but there are grants, and disability rights and justice are always integrated into it. So when I'm thinking about kind of baseline community organizing and community building and what we can do, my advice always would be to start incorporating disability in the discourse, because that's going to allow communities and cultures to be self-organizing. And you're kind of being a facilitator of those connections just by making sure that they're included, right? And events are accessible, et cetera.
So in closing then, where I want to sort of go is, in one of your lectures, I believe that you had mentioned something to the effect that you don't think we've gone far enough. I'm older than you, so my experience literally has probably started foremost with the political movement. But you're younger than me, so you have a better idea of the upcoming generations. When you say that we haven't come far enough, where are we today, and where would you like to see us in 10 years, 20 years?
The notion of going farther is not necessarily separate from that lineage. It's just to continue, right? So in ways, I think there are a few ways. One is just to recognize that disability identity and culture are things, and having that be a part of our lexicon, how we're thinking about, so surveys, for example. City surveys sometimes don't ask about whether someone identifies as disabled, in contrast to is diagnosed with disability, right? And that has implications for lots of things you could imagine, right? So that's one thing, and with that turn, folks will hopefully start to understand how disability identity is often, is always imbricated and overlapping with all of these other identities, such as, racial, ethnic, sexual, et cetera. So disability identity itself will become more plural and less kind of siloed. And lastly, going further, I think, means disabled people in leadership positions. A lot of the civil rights fight, or the disability justice contention and fight is really to gain agency and to gain decision-making power, because we're often so far down we're often not invited as disabled people to the table, right? So what's really awesome and fun as a professor at Art Center is to be able to start shifting pedagogy and curriculum. That's a lot of fun, right? And that can only happen if I have the agency to do so, right? So imagine if more disabled professors were out there, if more disabled architects and folks involved in leadership positions at the city who knew about disability culture and identified with disability identity, things will naturally start to tip and be a little bit more accepting and welcoming for us.
Are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful, yeah.
Oh, that's really great. At this time of great stress in our society, it's nice that you're holding on to that. Well, thank you so much for being our first guest. It was terrific.